cursed coffin. It all started when I took a job cleaning out estate homes. Easy work, decent pay. People die, their families don't want to deal with their junk, and companies like mine haul it all away. I never cared much for the personal history of the things we handled, until I found the coffin. The house was an old Victorian monster, its exterior rotting, windows boarded up. The owner, a man named Richard Galloway, had passed months ago. No family, no heirs, just decades of hoarded antiques, stacks of yellowed newspapers, and an eerie silence that made the place feel more like a mausoleum than a home. The basement was the worst. Cold, damp. The air reeked of mold and something else, something metallic and rancid. It was darker than it should have been, the single overhead bulb flickering weakly as I stepped inside. And there it was. Coffin. Not a normal, polished casket. This was old. The wood was nearly black, the surface covered in strange carvings. I ran my fingers over them, feeling their deep grooves. The lid was held shut by thick iron chains, bolted into the floor. Everything about it screamed, "Do not touch." But I was an idiot. I called my coworker, Joel, down to take a look. "Jesus, man," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Why the hell is there a coffin chained to the floor?" "Rich people are weird," I joked, but my voice sounded hollow. I knew we should report it, call someone, but all I could think about was how much it might be worth. This thing wasn't mass-produced, it was ancient. If it was some kind of historical artifact, we could sell it for a fortune. So we unbolted the chains. The moment the last one came loose, the entire house sighed. I know how that sounds, but that's the only way I can describe it. Like the walls had been holding their breath, waiting. Joel and I exchanged glances. He must have felt it too, but neither of us spoke. Instead, we loaded the coffin onto the truck and drove it back to my garage. That night, the knocking started. At first, I thought it was just the wind. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. Knock, knock, soft, from inside the garage. I sat up, my pulse quickening. I wanted to ignore it, but then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. I grabbed a flashlight and forced myself downstairs. My breath fogged in the air as I stepped into the garage. The coffin sat in the center, just as we had left it. I stared at it for a long time. Then the lid shifted. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my grip. No, that wasn't possible. It was just an old wooden box. It wasn't. Something moved inside. My breath hitched. The knocking turned into a slow, deliberate scratching. I ran. The next morning, I called Joel. "Dude," I said the moment he picked up. "Something's wrong with this thing." He sighed. "You're being paranoid." "It knocked," I whispered. There was a pause. Then, quietly, "It knocked for me too." Neither of us spoke for a while. "We have to get rid of it," he finally said. I agreed. But when I went back to the garage, the coffin was open, empty, and the carvings on the lid had changed. We tried everything. We burned it. The flames died before they even touched the wood. We dumped it in the river. It was back in my garage the next morning. We even took it to a scrapyard. The workers refused to touch it. One guy took a single look at the carvings and backed away, muttering in a language I didn't understand. Joel started losing it after that. "It's cursed," he kept saying. "We let it out. We let it out." I wanted to believe he was just being dramatic, until the shadows started moving, until I started seeing it. It wasn't just paranoia. Something was in my house. I would catch glimpses of it from the corner of my eye. A shape just barely there. Long fingers curling around door frames. A silhouette standing at the end of the hallway, unmoving, watching. Every time I turned to face it, it was gone. I stopped sleeping. I kept all the lights on, but darkness seemed to cling to the corners of my house, thick and unnatural. The whispers started next, soft at first, then closer. "You let me out." I stopped answering my phone, stopped leaving my house. I could feel it closing in. Then Joel went missing. I found his car outside my house, the driver's side door open. His phone was in the seat, screen cracked, smeared with something dark. He was gone. The whispers were louder that night. one is not enough. I barricaded myself in my room, gripping a baseball bat like it would do anything. I knew, deep down, that this thing didn't care about doors or walls. It had come from the coffin. It had been locked away, and now it was free. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, I wasn't in my room. I was in the garage, lying inside the coffin. The lid was half closed, and something was above me. I couldn't move. I could only see its outline, its hollow eyes peering down, its grin stretching too wide. Its fingers traced the edge of the lid. One must take your place. The lid slammed shut. Darkness swallowed me whole. I woke up screaming. I was back in my room. The coffin was gone, but something else was in its place. A mirror, and when I looked into it, my reflection smiled. Even though I wasn't. I stepped forward. I didn't. The glass rippled, and then I was inside, watching as it turned and walked away in my body. I don't know how long I've been here. Days? Months? Time is meaningless behind the glass. I scream, I pound, but no one can hear me. I watch as it lives my life, wears my face, speaks with my voice. I watch as it places a listing online, selling an antique coffin. No questions, no haggling, just one rule. Keep your doors locked tonight. The cursed coffin. It started when my uncle died. Uncle Henry was an odd man, eccentric, reclusive, and obsessed with the occult. He lived alone in a crumbling Victorian house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dusty books, strange relics, and a lifetime's worth of secrets. When he passed, the responsibility of clearing out his home fell to me. I wasn't particularly close to him, but I was his only living relative. The house smelled like time had stopped inside. Stale air, mildew, and something else, something metallic. It made the back of my throat itch. I spent the first few hours sorting through his belongings, boxing up old clothes and throwing away junk. That's when I found the door to the basement. A heavy iron lock secured it, rusted but still sturdy. It was the only locked door in the entire house. Curiosity gnawed at me. If Uncle Henry had locked it, he hadn't wanted anyone down there, which meant that's exactly where I needed to go. I found the key in his desk drawer, wrapped in a strip of old, yellowed cloth. I should have stopped right then and there, but I didn't. The basement smelled of damp earth, as if it had been dug straight into the ground. The air was thick, heavy, pressing against my skin like invisible hands, and in the center of the room sat a coffin. It was made of wood so dark it was almost black, carved with swirling symbols I couldn't decipher. The lid was slightly ajar. That was the moment I should have turned and walked away. Instead, I stepped closer. My fingers brushed the edge of the lid, and a cold shock ran through my body, like I had touched a live wire. My vision blurred, just for a second. Then I heard the whisper, soft, almost a breath. "Let me out." I yanked my hand back, my pulse hammering. No, it had to be my imagination. The basement was playing tricks on me. I forced myself to take a deep breath. It was just an old box, that's all. And it had to be worth something. I sold it. It didn't feel wrong at the time. I was clearing out a house filled with strange junk. Why not make a little money? I listed it online, barely thinking twice. Within minutes, I got a reply. No questions, no haggling. Just one message. "I'll take it. Cash. Tonight." The buyer's name was Elias. He arrived at my house after dark, his car idling at the curb. He was pale, thin, and dressed in a long black coat despite the summer heat. When he saw the coffin, his face darkened. He ran a hand over the carvings, his fingers tracing them like a man reading Braille. "You shouldn't have touched it," he said. A chill ran up my spine. "It's just a box." Elias gave me a long, unreadable look before handing over the money. "Keep your doors locked tonight." Then he left, coffin in tow. I should have felt relieved. Instead, my stomach twisted with something I couldn't name. That night, the whispering started again. But this time, it was inside my house. I woke up at exactly 3:12 a.m. The air in my bedroom was suffocating. My ears rang with silence. Then, knock, knock. I froze. It wasn't my front door. Came from inside my closet. Knock, knock. I held my breath, heart pounding against my ribs. The whisper followed, curling through the air like smoke. You let me out. My blood turned to ice. The door creaked open on its own. Darkness yawned inside, thick and impenetrable. Then something stepped out. I don't remember screaming, but my throat burned the next morning. I tried to call Elias. The number was disconnected. I drove to the address he had given me. There was no house, just an empty lot filled with dead grass. The coffin was back in my garage. I felt sick. I tried to destroy it, took a sledgehammer to it, but the wood didn't even splinter. I poured gasoline over it and lit a match. The flames died instantly. The whispering didn't stop. I left my house, booked a cheap motel, and locked the door behind me. But that night, knock, knock, the sound came from the motel closet. It had followed me. Desperation led me to the only place I could think of, Uncle Henry's study. I tore through his books, looking for answers. There was nothing at first. Then I found it, a leather-bound journal, filled with his cramped handwriting. The coffin is not a resting place. It is a doorway. Do not open it. Do not listen to it. And whatever you do not let it touch you. I could barely breathe. Then my eyes landed on the final line. If it escapes, the only way to seal it again is with another soul. I read that line over and over, feeling the weight of its meaning settle deep in my bones. I had let something out. The only way to trap it again was to give it someone else. I drove back to my house, hands shaking on the wheel. The street was empty, washed in pale moonlight. My house stood in eerie silence, waiting. The garage door was open. The coffin was still there, but this time the lid was fully open, and something was standing beside it. Tall, shadow-thin, its fingers stretched long enough to scrape the floor. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes on me. It didn't move, didn't speak, just waited, waiting for me to make a choice. I thought about Elias, about how fast he had wanted the coffin. Had someone given it to him? Had he been running just like me? I realized then that I was never meant to own the coffin. I was meant to pass it on. The next morning, I placed the listing online again. Just like before, I got a response immediately. A man named Daniel. No questions, no haggling. I met him in an empty parking lot. He ran his hands over the carvings, just like Elias had. I forced myself to smile. It's just an old box. Daniel gave me a long look before handing over the cash. I turned to leave, but he called after me. Keep your doors locked tonight. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to walk away. The weight on my chest lifted. The whispering stopped. I slept through the night. It's been weeks. I tell myself I did what I had to, that it would have been me if I hadn't passed it on. But sometimes, in the silence of my house, I hear something. A whisper, a knock, a reminder that the coffin is still out there, still waiting, and one day it might find its way back to me. The cursed coffin. I should have never taken the coffin, but greed makes fools of us all. It started with a simple job, cleaning out an abandoned estate on the edge of town. The house belonged to an old man named Elias Grayson, a recluse who had died alone under mysterious circumstances. The bank hired me and my friend Luke to clear out the place before it went up for auction. The house was massive, the kind that felt like it had secrets buried in its walls. Dark wood paneling, dust-coated chandeliers, and the faintest scent of decay hanging in the air. We spent hours hauling out old furniture and useless junk, but then we found the basement, and that's where everything went wrong. The basement door was locked, rusted shut from years of neglect. It took both of us pushing against it before it groaned open. The air that spilled out was thick, damp, and ice-cold despite the summer heat outside. The basement itself was enormous, lined with old bookshelves and crates covered in rotting tarps. But at the center of the room sat something that didn't belong. Coffin. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Black wood, smooth as glass, with strange carvings covering its surface. Symbols, some spirals, others jagged runes that made my stomach turn when I looked at them for too long. "This thing has to be worth something," Luke said, running his hand over the lid. "Antique, maybe? We could flip it." I hesitated. The air around it felt wrong. Too still. Too heavy. But I let my greed win. We loaded it onto the truck, ignoring the way the basement door slammed shut behind us. That night, I dreamt of whispering. At first, it was just faint murmurs, like voices drifting through walls. Then it became clearer, a chorus of low, rasping voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. Then I saw it, the coffin. I was standing over it, watching as the lid slowly creaked open from the inside. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. A hand emerged, not human. The fingers were too long, the nails cracked and yellowed. Then something began pulling itself free. I woke up gasping. The whispering didn't stop. I sat upright, my heart pounding, ears straining in the dark. The voices weren't just in my dream. They were in my house. And then, knock, knock. My breath caught in my throat. The sound came from downstairs. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. Slowly, I crept to the staircase, the beam of light shaking in my hands. Another knock. It was coming from the garage, from the coffin. Luke didn't believe me when I called him. "You're just freaking yourself out," he laughed. "It's an old box, probably just settling." But I knew what I heard. Still, I told myself he was right. I forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. The coffin was open. Not all the way, just an inch, but enough to see the darkness inside. Luke still didn't take it seriously, so I decided to get rid of it myself. I called a guy I knew who ran a junkyard. He agreed to take it off my hands, no questions asked. I drove it there myself, refusing to glance at the rearview mirror. The entire way, I felt like I wasn't alone in the truck, like something was breathing just behind me. By the time I reached the junkyard, I was sweating. "Just leave it over there," the guy said, barely looking up from his cigarette. I shoved it off the truck bed and left without a word. I thought it was over. I was wrong. That night, I woke up to whispering again. But this time, it was in my room. I turned on the light, heart hammering, and froze. My bedroom door was open. I always shut it. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that I was just on edge. Then I heard the knock. Slow, hollow. Knock, knock. I turned toward my closet. The sound had come from inside. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, the door creaked open. I didn't see what was inside. I didn't want to. I ran. I slept in my car that night. The next morning, I drove straight to the junkyard. The coffin was gone. I found the guy who ran the place, but his face went pale the second I mentioned it. "We didn't take it," he said, his voice shaking. "It was gone by morning. We checked the security cameras. The footage cut out for 3 hours. I felt sick. I rushed home, dreading what I would find. And there it was, sitting in my garage, waiting. I lost it. I grabbed a sledgehammer and swung at the coffin, putting everything I had into it. The wood didn't even crack. It didn't so much as splinter. I felt something watching me, breathing behind me. I turned. Nothing was there. But I knew I wasn't alone anymore. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room watching the garage door, waiting. The whispers came at midnight. Then the knocking, louder this time. And then, the door handle twisted. I grabbed my car keys and ran. I don't know where I thought I was going, but I knew I had to get away. I drove through town like a madman, the whispers echoing in my head, getting louder and louder. Then I saw Luke's house. I slammed the brakes. He needed to see it, needed to believe me. I pounded on his door, but there was no answer. His car was in the driveway. He had to be home. I tried the knob, turned. The house was dark, too quiet. Then I saw the footprints, trailing from the door, wet, muddy, leading upstairs. "Luke!" My voice barely came out. No response. I followed the footprints to his bedroom. The door was open. He was sitting on the bed, facing the window, Something was wrong. His head was tilted too far to one side, his shoulders unnaturally stiff. Then he turned, and I saw his face. His eyes were gone. His mouth was stretched into a gaping, silent scream, and carved into his forehead, the same symbols from the coffin. The whispering filled the room, coming from everywhere. And behind him, in the corner, something moved. Tall, thin, watching me, smiling. The last thing I remember was the world going dark. I woke up in the coffin, trapped. I screamed, clawed at the inside. No one could hear me, because now I was the one inside, and someone else had opened the lid. The cursed coffin. I never should have touched it. It all started when my uncle died. Martin Westwood was an eccentric old man, the kind who collected strange artifacts and told stories that no one believed. He lived alone in a crumbling Victorian mansion at the edge of town, a house that kids dared each other to run past on Halloween. When he passed away, my family wasn't exactly grieving. He'd been reclusive for years, and most of us assumed he'd gone mad. Still, he left everything to me, his only nephew. I had no idea why. I hadn't seen him in over a decade. The house was a nightmare. Dust choked the air. The wallpaper peeled in thick, curling strips, and every floorboard groaned under my weight. I spent the first few days sorting through his belongings, deciding what to sell and what to keep. Then I found the coffin. It was in the basement, hidden behind a wall of old bookshelves. I only noticed it because of the smell, earthy and faintly metallic, like rusted iron and damp soil. When I moved the shelves aside, I saw it. A long, black coffin with deep carvings along the sides. Strange symbols, ones I didn't recognize. The lid was bolted shut with thick iron latches. Something about it made my skin crawl. I should have left it alone. Instead, I did what any idiot would do. I pried the latches open. The moment the last latch came undone, the basement lights flickered. A low groan filled the air, like wood shifting under immense pressure. I hesitated, suddenly unsure. Then the lid slid open on its own. Inside was nothing but darkness. No corpse, no dust, no lining. Just blackness deeper than it should have been. The moment I looked into it, my stomach dropped. It felt like I was staring into something endless, like the space beneath the world. Then the whispering started. At first, it was faint, like wind rustling through dead leaves. Then it grew louder, a chorus of voices speaking in a language I didn't know. The air turned ice cold. My breath came out in pale, white clouds. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. The whispers stopped. Silence settled over the basement. Then a single, sharp knock came from inside the coffin. I ran. That night, I locked the basement door and tried to forget about it. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the old house was playing tricks on me. But then the knocking started again. First, it was faint, a slow, rhythmic tapping from below. Then it grew louder, more insistent. It didn't stop. At 3 a.m., I woke up to find my bedroom door open. I was sure I'd closed it. The air was freezing, my breath fogged in the dim light. And then, knock, knock. I nearly fell out of bed. The sound had come from inside my closet. I didn't move, couldn't. My muscles locked in place, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refused. The closet door creaked open, inch by inch. The darkness inside seemed deeper than it should have been, like the coffin. Then I saw them. Hands. Pale, skeletal hands reaching out from the blackness. Long fingers curling toward me, their nails cracked and jagged. I finally found my voice. I screamed. The hands vanished. The door slammed shut. Then the whispers returned, pressing against my ears, sliding under my skin. He opened the coffin. He must take its place. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had a plan. I was going to bury the coffin. I dragged it up from the basement, every movement filling me with nausea. The wood was strangely warm, pulsing under my hands like something alive. The carvings seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. I loaded it into my truck and drove to the old cemetery on the outskirts of town. The place was abandoned, overgrown with weeds and cracked tombstones. I dug a hole, as deep as I could manage. The whole time, I felt watched, the back of my neck prickling with unseen eyes. The whispers followed me, growing louder, angrier. I pushed the coffin into the grave and began to shovel dirt over it. My hands shook. My breath came in ragged gasps. Then the ground trembled. A low, guttural sound rose from beneath me. A groan, like a door opening after centuries of being sealed shut. And then the coffin lid snapped open. I stumbled back, choking on a scream. A hand emerged, then another. A figure pulled itself free. It wasn't human. Tall, impossibly thin. Its skin stretched tight over jagged bones. Its face was wrong, too long, too sharp, with hollow, gaping eye sockets. It smelled of rot and earth. And it smiled. I ran. I don't remember getting home. I locked the doors, the windows, every possible entrance. But it didn't matter. The knocking started again. This time it came from the walls, the floors, the ceiling. He opened the coffin. He must take its place. The whispering wouldn't stop. The shadows in my house stretched too far, creeping toward me like hungry things. I tried to call someone, anyone. My phone screen only showed static. At midnight, the lights died. In the darkness, I heard footsteps, slow, measured, coming up the stairs. My bedroom door creaked open. I didn't see it. I didn't have to. I felt it standing there, watching, waiting. Then the whisper came again, right beside my ear. Time to trade places, and the world went black. I woke up in the coffin, trapped. I screamed, clawed at the inside. No one could hear me. No one would ever hear me, because now I was the one inside, and someone else had opened the lid.